Okay, so the question I asked in my lecture had to do with diversity, which is widely regarded as an extremely desirable goal that universities and other organizations want to achieve to make sure that everywhere various groups are represented more or less in proportion to the size in the population. And the argument is that to some extent this is a compensation for past discrimination, but also that it is economically efficient. As an economist, I was particularly interested, of course, in the efficiency argument. To what extent is diversity economically beneficial? And I spent a fair amount of time reading the history of this kind of question. And the conclusion I came to is that diversity's impact on the economy depends crucially on the quality of the institutions. And that if institutions tend to be anti-pluralist and non-tolerant, that in fact having different groups in a society, whether they're ethnic groups or religious groups or linguistic groups, can actually be highly costly, because these groups will end up disagreeing and often fighting each other, and in many cases they lead to historical disasters. The most recent is perhaps the expulsion of 1 million Rohingya out of Myanmar, but examples can be found all over history on every continent. And so the main argument I would make is that what is really crucial is the emergence of pluralist institutions in which people basically taking a live and let live approach, at least as far as the formal rules of behavior in a society are concerned. And so I tracked the history of that, going all the way back to the beginning of the Reformation. And the Reformation is in many ways an interesting example here, because obviously it created a great deal of diversity, at least religious diversity in Europe, with the emergence of Protestantism. But at first it was extremely costly, in the sense that people who adhere to different religions ended up fighting one another in one religious war after another. And then slowly over time we can see the emergence of pluralism coming out of the literature, first in the 16th and early 17th century, and eventually with Enlightenment writers who all, in one form or another, preached for tolerance. And what we see is that in countries that adopted relatively pluralist institutions, such as England and the Netherlands, the economic dividends of these policies were quite high. It's important to stress that these societies were not tolerant by modern standards. So they were still discriminating in every dimension you can think of against these people, but they let them stay, and they were allowed to remain in those countries because they contributed to the economy. And we see this in spades in England in particular, where so-called dissenters, who are not members of the Anglican Church, contributed way above their proportion in the population, in the growth of manufacturing, the growth of science, and in particular in educational institutions. The same thing is true in the Netherlands, and the same thing is true in a somewhat different way in Imperial and Weimar Germany. But what history also, I think, suggests is that these institutions, this pluralism, remains fragile, it remains vulnerable. And in many cases we see nations that had been quite pluralist in their institutions and tolerant in their culture change and make a U-turn, so to speak, and adopt extremely anti-pluralist institutions. And that's an everlasting danger. We should never forget that Weimar Germany between 1919 and 1933 was an extraordinarily pluralist society that basically turned from pluralism to an extreme form of anti-pluralism with the rise of the Nazis. But Germany is not unique in this, and what happened to Germany could happen in many other countries, and is in fact happening in the world today. And so understanding better where pluralist institutions come from and how they are dependent on a culture of tolerance, a culture in which people can accept the notion that as long as other people don't act on their beliefs, they should be able to live with people who hold violently different beliefs than their own. And these beliefs may include things that have to do with science. You know, for instance, in the United States, there's a long debate between people who are committed to the theory of evolution and a minority who thinks that the theory of evolution is wrong. There is absolutely no reason why they shouldn't basically tolerate one another, and so far they do. But there is always the concern that one group will try to impose its belief on a minority or an outgroup. And that is precisely why we need strong institutions that guarantee, ironclad guarantees, that minorities, whether they are religious or ideological or they look different, should be given completely full rights and allowed to live their own lives as they see fit, as long as they don't harm anybody else. Well, this is a conference of people primarily interested in monetary policy and macroeconomics. Having been an economist for my entire life, even so I am mostly working on other things, you cannot possibly be not interested in the questions that people are talking about. What is going to happen to prices? What is going to happen to GDP? How will monetary policy affect the economy? If you're an economist, you have been exposed to these questions, and this is a meeting of some of the smartest, best informed and most creative economists working in that area. Some of them in universities, some of them in central banks, some of them in the private sector. And the dialogue that's coming out of here is extremely useful, and the presentations are sophisticated, informed, and really at the cutting edge of economic science today. And so I am learning every minute I'm sitting in that room.